involved quite a bit of understanding of the back and forth and the debate to start out with, and so I wanted to give you a little bit of background. And so, just to keep everything straight, I decided to kind of structure this like a tennis match. So on one side you have the non-theist, and I'll just have Richard Dawkins to designate that. And I couldn't think of who to do for the theist, so how about Billy Graham? Would that work for everybody if we did that? And so you'll see this tennis ball going back and forth, and that will represent which argument is being made here, just to keep everything straight. You also have it on your handout. So initially, the non-theist is going to hit the ball to the theist here with the evidential problem of evil. And you've almost definitely heard this in some form in debates about theism. It's basically, how can a good God allow suffering? That's the most simple version of it. Maybe a more analytic philosophy type version of saying it is this first premise is our world frequently contains evil that appears to us to be unjustified. It seems like, based on all of the bad things that happen, it doesn't seem like there's an underlying cause or an underlying reason, justifying reason for every single one of those instances of evil. Premise 2 is that based on that, we can conclude reasonably that some of it actually is unjustified. Maybe there are certain things that we can't understand, but this second premise is saying that at least some of that evil that we see is actually unjustified. There's a problem there. Premise 3 is that if the omnipotent, just God that the Judeo-Christian tradition believes in exists, then he wouldn't allow this kind of actually unjustified evil. And so the conclusion is that God does not exist. Most likely. So that's what the evidential problem of evil is it ends with this probably no such God exists. Whoops. Oh man, what did I do? Okay, thanks. So, the theist is going to hit the ball back to the non-theist with an idea that is going to say that this is an unjustified inference. From the appearance of unjustified evil to the actuality of unjustified evil, that does not work. That's something that's not a just inference, or not a correct, valid inference that you can make. And they're going to say this with the idea of skeptical theism. And this, again, you've probably heard in kind of a more layman's context. It's basically saying, maybe we're just like little children compared to God. His knowledge is so great and so infinite, and ours is so limited. There's no way that we could really expect to know all of the reasons for his actions. Stephen Weikstra, who's kind of my main sparring partner with this paper, he had this idea in the 80s that he called it a no-seum inference. Do you know what a no-seum is? It's a little bug that's so small that literally you can't see it. And so they can still bite you, but you can't see them. So he said basically if you're out camping and your friend says, hey, can you look in the tent and see if there are any St. Bernards in there? And you look in the tent and you don't see any St. Bernards, that's a pretty good reason for thinking there are no St. Bernards, because if there were St. Bernards, you would see them. But if your friend says, hey, can you check and see if there are any no-seums in there? And you look and you don't see any no-seums, that's not a very good reason to think there are no no-seums. Because if there were no-seums, you wouldn't see them. And so he says that God's reasons are more like no-seums than they are like St. Bernards. That's the idea of skeptical theism. Again, a more analytic philosophy way of saying it with premises and conclusions is we have no good reason for thinking that the goods we know of are representative of the goods that actually exist. The same is true of evils, and the same is true of the entailment relations between the goods that we see and the evils that we see. So they say that with these combined, basically we have no good reason for thinking that the moral facts that we know of are representative of the moral facts that actually exist. And I'll refer to this through the rest of the presentation as ST1 through ST3. These are the primary premises that the skeptical theist is committed to. But don't worry, the non-theist has a response. They are going to say that if we are actually committed to all of these, if these are things that we really do want to believe in, that commits us to a level of moral skepticism that seems to undermine our ordinary moral reasoning. And so this was first presented by Almeida and Aki in 2003. And so they say that ST1 through ST3 imply moral skepticism. They completely undermine our ordinary moral decision-making. They say on the basis of our acceptance of ST1 through ST3, we should insist that it is not unlikely that there is some good which, if we were smarter and better equipped, we would not recognize as a reason for us not intervening to stop some evil. So I'll present this as kind of just a personal anecdote. What I do as a part-time job while I'm in college is I run this after-school program for refugee kids in Southwest Houston. And all the time I have to make certain decisions about how to make the best program, right? And so if one kid is acting up, I'm definitely not going to kick the kid, right? That may fix the problem, but there seems to be some kind of guttural response to not kicking kids. That's not even on the table. So even if I endorse ST1 through ST3, I'm probably not going to go around kicking kids. But I do actually have to think about whether or not to kick kids out of the program, right? To tell them they can't come anymore, they have to stay home. Because it's a voluntary program, and I am trying to create the best outcomes for all of the students. But if I'm actually committed to ST1 through ST3, and I think that the consequences that I can predict are not at all representative of the consequences that will actually happen in the real world, then there's no good basis for me kicking this kid out of the program, right? I might as well just flip a coin to make the decision, because there's no basis for me thinking that my predictions of consequences are going to be accurate at all. That's the idea with this moral skepticism objection. So in cases where consequences seem to be the most important thing, we're left in moral paralysis. We can't make a real decision, and we have to just flip a coin. So the non-theist is going to try to say that maybe we're thinking wrong about the consequences that are important to us. Maybe we need to limit the scope of consequences in order to make our ordinary moral reasoning at ST1 through ST3 coincide. That's the main point. So they're going to come up with this expected utility reply. And Stephen Wykestra, in a 2017 article, I talked about him back in the 80s, he's still famous now. In 2017, he decided to bring in some ideas from Derek Parfit in On What Matters. It's a book that was published in 2011, really important ideas for normative ethics. And so Derek Parfit comes up with 3 different senses of wrong. And so Wykestra wants to say, okay, maybe all these senses of wrong correspond to different ideas in the skeptical theism debate, and we can decide on one sense of wrong is the one that's really important here. So the one that they're going to want to reject is the fact-relative sense of wrong. An act is wrong in the fact-relative sense just when an act would be wrong in the ordinary sense if we knew all of the morally relevant facts. So this is what they kind of, they call it the end of times consequences in kind of a pejorative sense. They say, this is saying that what's relevant to us are all of the consequences that could ever occur, and that's just completely unrealistic. We can't actually think about all of those things. And so we need some mechanism for limiting the consequences that are important to us, and that's going to save ST1 through ST3, they believe. So the first attempt is going to come from the belief relative sense. The belief relative sense says an act is wrong just when the act would be wrong in the ordinary sense if our beliefs about the facts were true. So this is really limiting the scope of consequences that are important to us. This is saying that only the things that we can actually think about at the time of our moral decision are going to be important to us. So it's taking it from all of the consequences that could ever happen to only the consequences that we can reasonably predict at the time of our moral decision. So Michael Bergman, he's probably the second most famous skeptical theist. He thinks that this is the kind of view that's correct, that we really do need to limit it just to the types of consequences we can predict at the time of our moral decision. Stephen Wykestra thinks that this is a mistake. He thinks that this is not going to work. He's also a skeptical theist, though. So he doesn't want that fact-relative sense. He doesn't want the end-of-times consequences. But he thinks that the belief-relative sense is too narrow. And he wants to show it with this thought experiment in the case of Hiker Sally. This is on your handout, too, if you want to follow along. Sally is a former U.S. Army Ranger who, while hiking in a remote area of northern Canada, finds a young boy manacled to a railroad track. Sally is left with 3 options. She can stay with the boy, hoping against hope that help will arrive. She can build a shelter around him and hike out for help, leaving him on the track for 3 days. Or she can use her battlefield medic skills to amputate the hands and feet and carry him out. So the key feature of this thought experiment is that she doesn't know anything about the train schedule. She's completely in the dark with regard to the train schedule. And if the train runs every single hour on the hour, then she better cut that kid's hands and feet off and get him out of there as quickly as possible. But if the train is completely decommissioned and doesn't run anymore, then the best thing to do would be to leave him on the track for a few days and go get help so they can get him off without amputating his hands and feet. And Wykestra thinks that the train schedule, while it's outside of the consequences she can predict, it's definitely morally relevant. And if she makes the wrong decision here, she's going to feel agony for the rest of her life. And so he thinks that if we have to decide between Hiker Sally's agony and Michael Bergman's theory of the belief relative sense of wrong, we've got to choose Hiker Sally's agony. It's just too counterintuitive to think that the train schedule is actually irrelevant to her moral decision making. So he wants to put forth that we should believe in the evidence relative sense of wrong. He says that the evidence, or Parfit says, the evidence relative sense of wrong is an act is wrong just when it would be wrong in the ordinary sense if we believe what the available evidence gives us decisive reason to believe, and these beliefs were true. So this is going to expand a little bit. This is not going to expand the consequences that are important to us all the way to the end of time, but it is going to expand it a little bit past the belief relative sense to give us some reason to try to learn more information. Give us some reason, it's called moral epistemology, when you're trying to learn more information, and that's going to be relevant for your moral decision making. And so then Weister comes up with a delineation for what exactly is the available evidence here, with what he calls the optimal moral horizon. So your optimal moral horizon is not going to be the end of time's consequences. It's not going to be consequences in the far distant future. It's just going to be those consequences you could predict if you were maybe a virtuous person, or you were being diligent, or you were sensitive to all of the relevant information. So he thinks in the Hiker Sally case, the train schedule is in her optimal moral horizon, even though she didn't know it at the time. Because she would have woken up that morning and she wasn't groggy and she was thinking ahead. Maybe she would have said, I gotta check the train schedule. I'm going through a place where the train may be running. I ought to know about this kind of thing. And so he thinks that also our moral horizons can be blocked by things such as just kind of like thick-headedness, not being understanding towards other people, not really like reading their nonverbal cues to tell that you're offending somebody, things like this. So this does influence quite a bit of our ordinary moral practices. So, now, we've got all the background, and actually just a little bit more than the background. I think that I am going to hit the ball on behalf of the non-theist here, because I think there's a problem with Stephen Weister's theory. I think his problem is that he and Parfit don't quite agree about what the evidence relative sense of wrong is, and what it means to us. I think there's a subtle difference in the way that the two of them would answer this question. Why are there limits on the consequences that are morally relevant to us? Weister would say that it's a formal limit, that when we say that something is wrong, we just mean that it's wrong, given that our moral horizons are limited in this way, and the evidence relative sense is what's most important. And so he wants to just completely throw out the fact relative sense. He says, it's unrealistic, we can't reach it, let's just toss it out. And we should only go with the evidence relative sense. Parfit doesn't say that. Parfit, the guy who came up with this theory, doesn't say that. He says that the evidence relative sense of wrong is an unfortunate necessity that comes because it would be silly to say to somebody, no, you shouldn't do what you think is wrong, given your evidence, you shouldn't do what you think is right, given your evidence, you should do what's actually right. Like that wouldn't make any sense. And so he says that the evidence relative sense of wrong is just, because of our epistemic limits, we have to settle for this, but it's not actually what we're shooting for when we talk about things being right and wrong. And he thinks that the evidence relative sense is regulated by the fact relative sense. He thinks that at the end of the day, the fact relative sense is what's most fundamental, it's what's most important. So if we find that there's some kind of difference between the fact relative sense, our evaluations in the fact relative sense, and our evaluations in the evidence relative sense, we've got to think that something is wrong with our evidence, that we need to defer to the fact relative sense. Here's another way of putting this. If we could acquire access to the end of time's consequences, would they be relevant for our moral decisions? Weister would say no, because they're outside of our optimal moral horizons. And he's just kind of set up this boundary of the optimal moral horizons as things that are not end of time's consequences, but things you would know if you were being properly sensitive. But Parfit would say, absolutely. This is exactly what we're shooting for. The only reason we're settling for the evidence relative sense is because we can't get to the fact relative sense. But if we could, then that would be what we should decide based on. That's what is ultimately important when we're talking about morality. Okay, so we've gone on this long tangent about normative ethics, and I hope that you've taken an ethics class or could at least enjoy this or appreciate it to some extent, enjoy consequentialism in some ways. But what's the import for skeptical theism, right? The import is that theists are committed to certain beliefs about end of time's consequences. Because here's what I'm thinking, is if you believe that every single instance of evil in the past was justified, was ultimately justified, had some kind of underlying reason, had some kind of good that was connected to it, then you've got to be committed to the possibility that future evils will also have some kind of good connected to them. But if you believe that, and we take Parfit's normative ethics, and believe that if you had access to end-of-time consequences, they would be relevant to you, then you've got to take that into account in your moral decision-making. So going back to my anecdote, going back to my example of creating an optimal learning environment for the students in my after-school program, is when I'm trying to make that decision about whether or not to kick that student out, all of a sudden now, if I believe in ST1 through ST3, I've got to take into account that there have been tons of suboptimal learning environments in the past. There have been tons of crappy teachers out there. And there have been tons of students whose learning potential has been sapped by a bad classroom environment. So what makes me think, and if all of those things occurred, and there was an ultimate justifying reason for it, what makes me think that there's not going to be some ultimate justifying reason for me allowing a suboptimal learning environment in my classroom, right? It seems like it's the wrong way of thinking about this to me. It seems really, really counterintuitive to think that we have to admit that there's a possibility that doing what seems like the wrong thing would actually have some kind of ultimate justifying reason. And so I think that Parfit's theory is much more plausible here. He came up with it. I think it makes much more sense that the fact-relative sense of wrong needs to regulate the evidence-relative sense of wrong. And increasingly, Weikstra's optimal moral horizon idea just kind of seems ad hoc. It seems like he's creating this delineation, not because there's really any substantial reason to, but because he wants to allow some expansion of moral epistemology without admitting the consequences of ST1 through ST3. So if you think that I'm right here, if you think that I've shown that this works, that Parfit's sense of wrong is much more plausible, or Parfit's idea of the evidence sense of wrong is much more plausible, and it has the result of moral skepticism when it's combined with ST1 through ST3, then there are a couple of different options you can think of for the theist. You know, they can concede theism, which is probably what a lot of people kind of on my side of the literature would want you to do. That's probably what Almeida and Aki wanted from their 2003 article. You could concede the rationality of your moral practices. I don't know any moral philosopher that would endorse that kind of an idea, but you could say like, you know what, I'm just going to keep making these predictions even though I don't think they're really accurate, but you know, it's the best I can do. You could change your moral practices, so you could start actually flipping coins when it comes to making consequentialist decision making. Or you could find a novel way to defend the skeptical theist from the moral skepticism objection. And that's what if you're really enjoying this and on top of it, if you want to try to do something like that in the question and answer section, I'm all ears. So this is my presentation. Do I have any questions here? I think. Yeah, we got like 10 minutes, so who wants the first question? Yes?
Was it necessary to start with with Rose's evidential argument where you ended up? I'm not well read on it.
Yeah.
I'm just questioning whether you had to start there or whether you could have started, you know, further down.
Yeah, probably not. I just thought that a lot of people here wouldn't know what skeptical theism was from the beginning, and so if I just started with that, they'd say like, well, you know, why are we even thinking about this kind of thing? I thought that most people are familiar with the problem of evil, and so that kind of gives reason for the theist to start coming up with an idea as crazy as skeptical theism. Or else that just kind of seems out of the blue. Yeah, that was my idea. Yes.
One question. Thank you for the presentation. I enjoyed Weikstra's sort of Sally example. I'm curious, you know, in terms of, because it seems clear that she lacks, I'm sorry, is Sally the one who's the ranger?
Yes.
Right, I can't remember who's under the train. Sally lacks the knowledge of the train schedule, right? And it's morally relevant because normatively she wants the practical effect.
Right.
But we wouldn't hold her morally responsible, would we, for not knowing it and making the wrong decision, or would we? I'm not sure there. What would you say?
I think maybe not in this example, but you could create a thought experiment that's really similar to this, where maybe she was just a little bit more reckless in not looking up the train schedule or something like that, or maybe it was something that she should have known or something.
Maybe like a crazy example. We would hold someone responsible if they didn't know that there's a meteorite going to land in that location.
Yeah.
On them, right? But that would be one where it would be beyond the normal thing, normal expectations.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think maybe the idea is that there are some cases where moral epistemology is important. You wouldn't say in cases like this that every single information that was outside of her knowledge at the time of her moral decision was irrelevant to her. You would want to say that we need some mechanism for blaming her for not trying to get more information, right?
The reason I'm wondering is because I'm thinking about how probably moral luck sort of rolls in on this. And I don't know.
Yeah, I think, I was actually thinking the same thing about like Nagel talking about the, we blame the drunk driver who actually hit somebody way more than the drunk driver that you're talking about. And yeah, I think that that maybe if you could say to that kind of a case, if you believed in just the belief relative sense of knowledge, you say, well, they didn't know there was going to be a kid running around in the street in the middle of the night or something like that. But you know, they should have tried to expand their knowledge rather than, we're not going to only blame people for the things that they know at the time when they're making their moral decision. We've got to have some kind of moral epistemology in there. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a real neophyte with all this, so can you just give me a definition of what skeptical theism is? Maybe I'm off.
Yeah.
Using the word skeptical with theism,
It's-
as
so-
if you're like in between.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so,
It's almost kind of like a tongue-in-cheek title. Like so the idea is that it's two parts. It's the skeptical and the theism. So the theism says we believe in God. The
Right.
skepticism says we are skeptical about our ability to understand God's reasons for
Okay,
things.
so
That's what the skeptical theist is skeptical about. Mhm.
thank you.
Mhm. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do theists, is a theist, in your opinion, generally committed that past evils are justified, or that just good can result from past evils? Not that they're necessarily justified, but that just,
I think it has to be. It has to be both. I think it has to be that enough good resulted from them for them to be justified. Because, like, I'm thinking, I don't think that you could say that, like, God would allow, like, you know, a kid to get cancer just so some other, like a doctor could feed his family or something like that. You would have to have, like, such an outweighing justifying reason, such an outweighing good, that it would make that evil pale in comparison. I think that's the kind of thing that a theist would be shooting for. So I think there does have to be some good that's connected to the evil, but it also has to outweigh the evil.
but that it's justified in the future, that evil can be justified. A theist I don't think that a future evil would be justified,
Mm-hmm.
just because some ultimate good could come from it. The good could come from it if the evil doesn't happen also.
Okay, if the evil doesn't... I think what I was thinking was that if we believe that all of these evils in the past have had some kind of underlying good connected to them, then it seems reasonable to think that the goods in the future, or the evils in the future would also have some good connected to them. There wouldn't be some kind of like big difference between the past and the future on that. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Does it sound like I'm understanding your question or not really?
Maybe I'm just not understanding yours. I'm just thinking that theists don't necessarily, they're not justifying the evil because something good may result. And I think.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I'm thinking, and you can let me know if you think this is a good example, is war.
Okay.
Like going to war to defeat Nazis,
Yeah.
a good would come out, but a lot of people on many sides would die
Right.
by just being on the battlefield.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps. That's
Yeah,
what
so
I was
maybe-
thinking when you were talking about this.
Right, so maybe like in the case of World War II or something like that. Like obviously there was tons of evil that happened in that war. But the thought is for the theist, if that happened and God exists, then that means there had to be some kind of good that was connected to that outweighed all of the evil that occurred there. That's
I see it. Yeah.
That's the idea. Yeah. That it couldn't be that there was a lot of evil that happened and a little bit of good that occurred, or else that wouldn't work. There wouldn't be enough justifying reason for him to allow such a thing.
Would the theists also concede that some evil was not justified? I mean, they're not saying that all of it is that correct?
They need to be committed to all of
They
it
need
being
to be,
justified.
okay.
Yeah. Maybe not that all of it is justified, but that okay.
It can be.
Yes, that we have no good reason for thinking that it's unjustified. That basically because there's such a distance between our knowledge and God's knowledge, that they're not trying to pick out every single instance of evil and try to explain to you what the justifying reason is. They're just trying to say, you can't sit here and tell me that you know it's unjustified, because you would not be able to understand God's reasons.
But isn't the problem the relativism in which in your premises you are putting at the same level good and evil?
Putting it this
You're putting at the same level good and evil in your premises, because you are
Yeah.
saying, you, pretty much you're saying if there is good and then if there is evil, ST1 and then ST2, then
Yeah.
both. And so what you are saying pretty much is if you go to the previous and the forward, you're saying previously there was evil, therefore something good has to come. It's the whole idea of everything happens for a reason.
Yes,
I
exactly.
don't agree with it.
Right.
I would say, but then I'm not even a skeptical, I am an atheist. Okay?
Yeah.
And then there is the whole idea of, and so in the future, we will have also evil and we will have also good.
Mhm.
So you are equalizing both, and I think that is a problem. How can, because then you go to moral values, the
Mhm.
true value. Are we going to put evil at the same equilibrium, the balance as good? I don't think so. I think as humanity, we strive for goodness.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? What I'm trying
Yes,
to say?
are you criticizing the skeptical theists' ideas?
Yeah.
This is the ST1 through ST3?
Yeah. Because they put both at the same level. So even, and I agree with the gentleman, as a
Mhm.
theist, I think people who believe in God want goodness all the time.
Mhm.
Some people who don't, by the way.
Yeah.
But you know, you want goodness, you want, I mean, one of the, you know, the peoples of the books, the three main religions, that's the whole idea. We want goodness, we don't want evil. So then when you say, oh, there is evil, and of course the word, the Nazi word is always the example, you know, out of that evil, something good came out. But the problem is that something bad should not have happened to have a war.
Okay, yeah. So you're saying,
You know?
so you're saying we should have
We should
just,
not have
yeah.
prosecuted the Jews. We should not have something, you know, so why? Why that?
Mhm.
And then it goes to your first point of, which I agree with you, then you start, because you start your presentation talking about the argument, the evidential argument for evil. I understand where you're coming from, and I applaud you, and I think you did a fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
Actually, because you made us all think.
Yeah.
But to me, it was like, and I was following you, and I was
Yeah.
getting into it. But then when all these conversations started, it was like, what is going on here?
Okay, I don't want to interrupt, those are really good questions, so like your presentation,
Yeah,
there's
that was
only 1
fantastic.
minute left
Yeah.
for the questions and answers, so like, I just want to let you know. because
Okay,
we have-
let me say something else to that, and then I'll hand over the mic here. So there is actually, I presented this all kind of in the realm of consequentialism, thinking of outweighing, justifying reasons and goods and all that. There is literature out there that thinks about it very differently about it in terms of deontology and God having a right to intervene and do all these things. So I think that's kind of part, it goes into what you're saying here, that maybe God didn't have a right to allow the evil in the first place, that was not his right to jump in and cause this evil on somebody to allow good to happen to somebody else. There is literature out there on that, and talking about what exactly, if God exists, what's his relationship to humans, and what kind of rights does that grant him to cause evil and suffering on some people to allow outweighing goods on other people. Yeah. Okay, very good. Andrew, you ready?